I am Dungeon Thrasher Lenny Blade, and this is the Dungeons and Thrashers show. This is part 2 of my Adventures in Middle-earth series, and this is the part where we look at the Loremaster's guide, and this is sort of the Loremaster is what the DM is called in Adventures in Middle-earth. So this is the companion piece to the player's guide, and these two books together, I'm telling you, there is so much stuff here. You could play for months, but we'll get more into that later. So you'll probably think that the Loremaster's guide would be the equivalent of the Dungeon Master's guide for Dungeons and Dragons, for example. This is sort of true, but this is so much more. This is a Dungeon Master's guide. It's a monster manual. It's also like a setting pamphlet, shall we say. Anyways, there's a lot to talk about here, so let's get into it. Alright, so right off the bat, the first thing that strikes me about this Loremaster's guide is how it emphasizes the epicness, the huge scope of the game. It talks about, you know, the tale of years and how years pass by, and characters are encouraged to marry and have children who will then replace their parents in the company, either because of retirement of the previous characters, the parents, or accidental retirement, aka death, or even fight alongside the other characters if if we're talking about the long-lived races like elves and dwarves. And there's actually rules about this in the Breland region guide, but we'll get to that later. I will try not to refer to too many of the other books in the series at this point. But as I said before, that this book is a mix of like a setting book, a Dungeon Master's guide, and a bestiary or a monster manual. There's some information about the different areas in the Wilderlands, or in the Rovanian, if you will. So what I did was, when I started the campaign, was I printed out the information about these areas, and I gave them to the players that were from that area. So if I had a Bjorning in the party, I would print out the information about the land of the Bjornings and give to him, physically give it to him. It's a lot more fun than just sharing PDFs over a Facebook group, you know. So physical handouts are always more exciting. There's also a timeline which you can use, and you can use this timeline in conjunction with the timeline in another supplement called the Mirkwood campaign, and you can sort of mesh the two together, and it works really well. I know several DMs, or sorry, LMs that have done that. So but yeah, so really cool stuff. This timeline here is from about 1050 to 2951, which would be the year Sauron sort of came back and reclaimed Mordor and all that. The Loremaster's guide also includes a guide to Lake Town. Lake Town is sort of the default opening sanctuary, the default open sanctuary that the company has at the beginning of the game. And this is very well detailed here in the Loremaster's guide. So there's a guide, and there are also maps, and every district is detailed with adventure seeds, and what's going on there, who stays there, what you can do in the different areas. There are also brand new fellowship undertakings that you can undertake if you're spending your fellowship phase in Lake Town. What I did in my campaign was I actually printed out, I blew this map up and I printed it out, and my characters, or my players, actually met a a walking merchant. This was right before they got to Lake Town, and so they actually bought a map for 20 silver, and I did the physical handout thing, and I gave them a copy of the map, and then they explored Lake Town on their own. It was a lot of fun. And yeah, there's tons of good advice on how to start off and how to continue your campaign in Middle-earth. Some general GM advice, and you know, some of this stuff that you've heard so many times and you've read them so many times before in under that Dungeon Master's guides that you know, it doesn't really feel like it's necessary. It just takes up pages. You know, but there are some cool stuff. There's some stuff about following canon, the Tolkien canon, how to be a lore master specifically to Middle-earth. And it also mentions that even Tolkien himself constantly revised and changed the canon of his own world. So while you should try to stick to the canon, it's not that rigid. Like, at least that's why I get out of it. Yeah, but most of the LM advice is pretty obvious stuff that doesn't need to be said again and again. There are some good things. They get into unsuccessful journeys, how and when to grant inspiration to your players. Multiclassing now, and there are also prerequisites if you want to multiclass into one class. You know, you need to have like a 13 of strength, for example. But I feel like if you read between the lines, Cubicle 7 is actually advising against it. If you check out the wording, that's what they do, because they keep telling that, you know, yeah, the classes are already quite diverse as it is, and they're very thematic. Like, mixing them up could sort of break that Middle-earth spirit. I'm paraphrasing here, of course. And I wasn't going to allow multiclassing at first in my first campaign, but they had already, the adventuring party had already become friends with the warriors of Mountain Hall on the west side of the Anduin River. So when it was time for a fellowship phase, the scholar of the party said, well, I want to go and visit our friends in Mountain Hall, and I want to train with them to become a warrior. And it fit thematically, so I let him do it. So I'm not sure if I would do that again. I think it depends on the story for me. Like, if it fits, I would allow it. There are also some optional rules for balancing the game. I guess they realized that for example, my power build from the last episode, if you remember, the Barding Warrior with a chainmail, a great shield, the defensive fighting style, and the Swordmaster virtue could start at level 1 with an AC of 21. Well, now they've added this optional rule that you cannot use the Sword Mastery virtue together with a shield. So that would balance the game a little bit. Boring. The journey rules has also been expanded upon, so if you're planning on using the journey rules in your regular D&D 5th edition campaign, which I think you should, then that chapter is absolutely invaluable, because they give the format, and they give a lot of advice for creating your own journey events and tables, and even descriptions as you travel. The Loremaster's Guide also includes a lot of NPCs, you know, like anything that you can encounter: chieftains, town guards, merchants, messengers, outlaws, elves, elf lords, dwarves, you know, dwarf lords, anything that you can think of. And what's cool about these NPCs is that it's not just a stat block. You also get the journey rules, so you have expectations and motivations, which modifies the audience rules. Well, for example, if your company failed to decipher some runes on an old blade found in the Barrow Downs, you may want to consult a sage and try to convince him to help you. Well, if you show that you're knowledgeable, you get a +2 on that final audience check. Whereas if you're trying to intimidate him, sages believe that violence is for fools, so you not only doesn't it work, but you also induce a -2 penalty to your roll. So that's very thematic, and it invites to a lot of role playing for the characters. And for example, if you're meeting a dwarf lord, you know, you can try to, if you talk very well about dwarven ancestry, and if you're praising dwarven craftsmanship and things like that, like subtle praise, you get a +1. But if you're trying to like sweet talk or like obvious ass kissing, that will grant you a -2 penalty. So it's a lot of it's a very versatile system, and I think it's really cool, and it invites to a lot of cool role playing. And yeah, speaking of audience rules, they are expanded upon as well, and there are ways it's included here how to plan and run your own audience rules and how to write your own expectations for your own NPCs. And there's a long example included as well. So again, invaluable advice for anyone who's looking to include the audience rules in their own regular Dungeons & Dragons 5e campaign. Alright, we have come to the battle and adversaries part of the book, which is really interesting. And I'm telling you right now, don't worry about the lack of diversity in the admittedly pretty short bestiary. You can make them extremely memorable and varied by using 2 features. The first one is combat scenery, and use the combat scenery rules to add variation to your encounters. So I think the idea that Middle-earth itself is a part of every battle is epic and yes, thematic and even Tolkien-esque, as it were. But there are examples for battle scenery that you could include, and they're listed by categories. So you have woodland, you have Mirkwood, you have mountainous areas and things like that. There's a lot of stuff going on here, and you even have atmosphere scenery and weather scenery. So there are about 70 different battle sceneries that also have like mechanical advantages and disadvantages, of course. So you can make it extremely cool using all these battle scenery rules. Personally, I used a lot of... I threw a couple of big rocks in this one battle, and the characters were obviously climbing the rocks to gain advantage on their attacks because they were on a higher level, and they were leaping from rock to aid their allies and so on. And one of the warriors rolled a double 1, which means he rolls a 1, and then I let them roll the d20 again. If they roll a 1 again, that's a fumble. That's a house rule. And then they roll a d6 to see how bad they fumble. So he rolled a 6, which means that his character broke her leg on the rock because she misjudged the distance, and then she fell down onto the ground. So the enemies were all over her, but she did survive, and everyone survived actually, but she had to splint her leg, and she couldn't walk or run properly for the rest of the journey and adventuring phase. And it was a memorable battle, you know, and that was just because I decided to throw in a couple of rocks, you know. And there are tons of examples like this to make your battles more memorable. The second feature to use to make your battles and encounters more varied and more memorable is creature actions and abilities. So there's a list of different abilities, bonus actions, reactions even, and group actions and abilities that you could assign to your encounters, to the monsters. So for example, instead of just throwing in an orc captain, okay, so you want to make the PCs remember that orc, so You give him the abilities Long Arms, which extends his reach, and a Disarming Strike. And you round him out with the Biter ability, and then finally add, 20 HP. There you go. That's a unique orc. That's a memorable orc captain. There's so much stuff in here. Like I said, there are bonus actions, reaction. There are also something called troop abilities, which are like that you can assign to a whole group of enemies. For example, the Vile Gang ability. So when things start to go sour for the characters, for example, the company's archers are out of arrows, or the fighter goes prone, or anything like that, all the members of that orc band adds a +1 to their attack and damage rolls. It's just one example, and there are also disadvantages as well. So, for example, if your company are already injured and sort of spent, and they stumble upon this orc band, you could be nice to them, and you can give them the ill-prepared for battle ability, which means that they suffer disadvantage on all their attack rolls as soon as one of their number gets hurt. So that's just a lot of versatility here, I think. There's also something called especially strong abilities, which you could give to like bosses and things like that. There's specific abilities attributed to orc kind, trolls, wargs, wolves, and so on. And all are extremely thematic and Tolkien-esque. Sorry, I had to do it. And it's super fun to the Loremaster to use all of these things. And, I mean, besides, there are additional adversaries in the subsequent books. But I'm telling you, this is all you need to make your battles memorable, varied, and, just very fun for everyone involved. But players, don't despair. There's a lot of good stuff for you too here. So even though it is said in the Loremaster's guide that heroes are supposed to be just that, they are supposed to be heroes, not murder hobos or treasure hunters, though that is the name of a class, right? But there are chapters on wondrous artifacts, legendary weapons and armor, and magical healing. Now, magical healing is it's a very short, it's just like 2 paragraphs. They go into herbs, lembas, the waters of Nimrodel and Mirror, things like that, magical healing and natural healing. And but the other stuff I mentioned here, the wondrous artifacts and the legendary weapons, are really cool. So let's start with the wondrous artifacts. Like, these are blessed items, and what that means is that every item is connected to a skill, and you get to add your proficiency bonus to that roll. So, for example, if you're already proficient with something, you get to add your proficiency bonus twice. And what's interesting and unique about this is that it actually becomes more powerful as the character grows, so they sort of grow together. And you can have a regular blessing, which is what I just explained to you. The greater blessing means that you also, on top of all this, you also have advantage on the skill check. So that's OP'd maybe, I don't know, but it's pretty cool. The legendary weapons and armors are cool as well, and there are rules how to create them. First you choose what kind of weapon, and then you determine the craftsmanship. Now there are 3 different ones to choose from: Elven, Dwarven, and Numenorian. Now the Dwarven craftsmanship obviously goes back, they're not talking about the Blue Mountains or the Iron Hills blacksmiths here. They're talking about the Novgorod or Belegos, like really ancient, from previous ages, those kind of blacksmiths. And then you select your Banes, and that's only available for Numenorian and Elven, because some of the enchanted abilities that you can assign to these weapons only work on the Bane creatures. And then you assign the qualities, and the qualities are pretty cool. So they are they can have a maximum of 3 qualities, and the first quality is revealed when the character is from level 1 to 4, and the second one when the character is 5 to 12, and the third one is 13 and up. 13 and higher levels. So which this also means that the legendary weapons and armor also grow with the character, which is really cool. And you don't know what these abilities are, I mean these enchanted abilities are, until you reach that level. Then you'll be like, oh, whoa, this has had a superior fell attached to it as well. Whoa. So that's some pretty cool stuff for sure. Okay, now after this comes my least favorite chapter in the whole book, and that talks about magic in Middle-earth. Especially there's a list of Middle-earth appropriate spells from the Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Now I don't let my players play casting classes from 5e. I think it takes away the wonder of magic in Middle-earth. I mean, look at all these spells. I mean, in the Wildlands campaign, my players were lent a magical stone from Radagast that could control the weather, and they had like 1 use or something. And they were holding this bridge. There was an invasion from the south, so there was a horde of orcs coming. And they tried to hold that bridge, but they couldn't. They had to retreat, and there was an army from Dale, approaching to meet this orc horde, consisting of forces from Dale and Lake Town, and I think there were a couple of dwarves from the Lonely Mountain as well, maybe some elves, I can't remember exactly. And they were marching south to meet this army. But the characters figured, the further south that the orcs can come before the battle happens, before they engage each other, the more farmsteads, the more villages will be burnt, the more cattle and people will be killed. So they decided to use that stone to cast a storm down on the orc horde, and they managed to slow them down so that the allied forces, I will call them, managed to regroup and organize, and finally the great battle happened. So, and there was a lot of discussion within the party. Oh, should we use it now, or should we wait? And that could have, all of that tension and cool roleplay could have just been negated by, oh yeah, I'm gonna cast control weather, So no, I'm not gonna allow that. I'm not gonna allow my players to cast spells like that, at least. There are, however, I mean, like I stated before, Middle-earth is full of magic. It's just that it's not at the hands of the players. And I think there are a few paragraphs here on creating your own Middle-earth themed magic, which is actually followed by a couple of examples from the books. Because it is a world full of magic. It's just, how do you harness that magic? Yeah, and there are some other AiAiME specific rules that are also slightly expanded upon, and there's some more new fellowship undertakings and so on, and there will be a lot more coming in the subsequent books as well. And there's a useful list of potential patrons and things like that, so all in all, pretty decent. These 2 books are all you need to roleplay in Middle-earth for months and months, maybe even years. Don't let anyone else tell you differently, because I've seen some crybabies on the internet, even on YouTube, saying that this is not a complete system and blah blah blah, you have to buy so many books. No, this is all you need. While there is no adventure per se in here, there are so many adventure seeds in this one that, if you've got a year or 2 of experience running games, you'll have no problem, unless you have some problems, if you're like dyslexic or you're one of those guys who absolutely have to have a pre-written adventure to run exactly as it is written. If you can use your imagination, and if you got a little bit of experience, you'll do all right. There are 32 adventure seeds in this one alone, and that's not even including all the opportunity that for adventure that generates while you're rolling on the journey table as you're journeying, though, like random encounters, random events that can actually lead to complete adventures. That's not even including those. And so there's a lot of roleplay, there's a lot of combat, there's a lot of story going on, and there's so much to do here. And I think these two books are all you need to start off, and then you can go into the modules. I'll talk more about the other modules and adventures later on, but for now, even if my last words will be, even if you're just playing regular Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, get these books and use the journey rules, use the audience rules, use the combat scenery, use all of that good stuff, and yeah, so warmly recommended, as you may have imagined by now. See you